Tonight, we step into the shadowed edges of America's forgotten suburbs, where streetlights flickered and no one realized a phantom was moving among them. Women vanished from sidewalks, were pulled from rivers, were found in alleys with a kind of violence that seemed too sudden, too senseless to explain. There are no ransom notes, no jealous lovers, no tidy motives to pin on a corkboard, only a rumor whispered first in Detroit and later in Houston. Someone out there is hunting, and he doesn't stop. His name was Coral Eugene Watts, a man who couldn't read a map without stumbling, who was dismissed as slow by nearly everyone who met him. Yet behind that blank, boyish stare was a compulsion so relentless it carved a trail across states. Investigators would later call him one of the most prolific serial predators in U.S. history. The public called him something else entirely. Unthinkable. This is not the story of an evil genius. It is the story of something worse. The streetlight hummed faintly above the sidewalk, casting a sickly orange glow over a suburban block. A young woman, jogging home just before midnight, never noticed a man who had been following her for several blocks. He was short, broad-shouldered, with an oddly vacant expression, an expression people often mistook for harmlessness. And when police later found her body in a shallow patch of weeds, there was nothing connecting her to him. No weapon, no motive, no obvious threat of hatred or passion. Just a pair of hands and a mind that didn't work the way anyone expected. Coral Eugene Watts didn't stalk his victims because they reminded him of someone, or because he sought revenge, or even because he wanted money. He had something simpler, more terrifying: compulsion. He killed for relief the way most people bite their nails. And the strangest part? On paper. He shouldn't have been able to orchestrate a string of murders across multiple states, evading detection for years. His IQ, tested by professionals, hovered at just 68, barely above the threshold used to define intellectual disability. Yet what's left behind a trail of bodies so widespread, so baffling, that investigators struggled to comprehend how he managed it. How could someone who couldn't properly grasp abstract concepts or solve basic problems construct a reign of terror that outpaced the cunning of smarter killers? Witnesses who encountered him in everyday life describe him as slow, simple, or gentle. But inside his own mind, a storm of violent fantasies brewed constantly, whispering the same instructions: hunt, attack, silence. Victims never saw him coming because they never believed a man with that blank, childlike face could hold such monstrous intent. His crimes were methodical in the way Hollywood imagines killers. No elaborate rituals, no cryptic letters to newspapers, no grotesque trophies. Just sudden, blunt eruptions of violence, like lightning strikes that left communities smoldering in confusion. By the time authorities realized they were facing one of the most prolific killers in U.S. history, Watts had already buried dozens of names beneath the soil of forgotten neighborhoods. The paradox is chilling. If intelligence is supposed to be the fuel for deception, what do we make of someone who had almost none, yet deceived everyone anyway? What does it mean when the simplest mind conjures the darkest nightmare? This is the story of Coral Eugene Watts, the man with an IQ of 68 and possibly over 80 victims. It was the 1970s in America, a decade buzzing with paranoia, where fear lived under every front porch light. Cities like Detroit and Houston were cracking at their seams, unemployment climbing, crime spilling across neighborhoods, and the police force stretched thin, always 2 steps behind whatever fresh terror surfaced that week. It was the perfect era for predators to vanish in plain sight, because the very structure of society was already on fire. Imagine Detroit in the early part of that decade. The factories that once promised prosperity were bleeding jobs. Whole communities were sinking into poverty, and the streets carried an atmosphere of quiet desperation. People locked their doors early, prayed their daughters would get home safe from evening shifts, and turned the radio louder to drown out sirens echoing down the block. Newspapers seemed to print endless headlines about bodies found in alleys, missing women never returning, and faceless attackers who seemed to move like shadows through the city. This wasn't the age of DNA. There were no neighborhood watch apps, no smartphones recording every flicker of danger. If someone disappeared, the police relied on door-to-door interviews, composite sketches, and sheer luck. Even the most organized investigations could dissolve into dead ends within days. In such an environment, a killer who left little trace was not just dangerous, he was practically invincible. And then there was Houston, where Watts would later migrate. A city teeming with young people chasing jobs and education, sprawling highways that allowed someone to disappear in seconds, and suburbs expanding so fast that crimes could happen in one neighborhood while police were tied up miles away. Houston's police department was drowning in cases, often mislabeling assaults, writing off disappearances as runaways, or chalking up murders to gang violence. Against this backdrop, Watts' attacks didn't look like the work of a serial predator. They seemed random, senseless, detached from motive. There were no notes, no threats, no neat little package for detectives to piece together. Just ordinary women going about ordinary lives, suddenly struck down with brutal force. Society in the 70s was obsessed with intellect. Schools, workplaces, and even the justice system treated IQ as destiny. The smarter you were, the more dangerous you could be. That assumption became a fatal blind spot. No one imagined a man labeled as dull or slow could orchestrate a killing spree spanning states. People thought intelligence equaled menace and stupidity equaled safety. Watts was living proof that society's measuring stick for danger was tragically broken. The streets were already haunted by fear, but Watts turned that fear into a silent epidemic. His killings blended into the background noise of urban decay. One body was tragedy. 2 bodies were coincidence. But dozens should have been impossible to ignore. And yet, somehow they were. Coral Eugene Watts was born in 1953 in Killeen, Texas, into a world that seemed almost destined to misunderstand him. His childhood wasn't a caricature of cruelty and abuse often used to explain away the making of monsters. Instead, his life was marked by something stranger, an almost mechanical detachment. Teachers saw a boy who lagged behind in class, struggling to read, fumbling through lessons most children absorbed with ease. Psychologists later measured his IQ at 68. Low enough to classify him as intellectually disabled, yet high enough to leave him floating in a gray area where people assumed he'd simply grow out of his slowness. But Watts didn't grow out of it. He grew into it. Those who knew him as a boy recall someone who wasn't violent in the typical sense. No cat mutilations, no fire starting, none of the cartoonish hallmarks the public clings to when they think about future killers. Instead, what crept through his early years was something subtler and perhaps more frightening. He was withdrawn, his imagination consumed not by games or friendships, but by sudden flashes of violence in his mind. While other kids were dreaming about baseball or comic books, Coral quietly imagined choking, stabbing, drowning. Not stories, not fantasies, acts. He later confessed that these thoughts haunted him as early as age 12, arriving uninvited and leaving him restless. His face told another story. Photographs show him with wide, unassuming eyes and a kind of half-smile that looked more confused and sinister. Neighbors described him as polite. Employers often found him hard-working in the most basic, task-driven ways. Women he encountered sometimes thought him shy, even timid. The world saw a man who wasn't clever enough to be threatening. But inside, he was carrying a storm. Watts claimed that hurting women gave him relief, a word disturbingly casual for what it meant. The release of pressure from an urge he couldn't seem to suppress. Relief, like scratching an itch, like finally exhaling after holding your breath too long. He never spoke of hatred, never spoke of pleasure, only relief. And here's the contradiction that keeps investigators awake. Watts lacked the intelligence to plan long cons, to weave elaborate lies, to manipulate detectives the way higher IQ killers famously did. Yet somehow, he avoided capture again and again, slipping through jurisdictions, exploiting police blind spots, and leaving a trail of victims that stretched from Michigan to Texas. He was not the evil genius archetype, but something more primal, violence stripped of theatrics, murder without motive. That's what makes him so hard to categorize. He didn't fit the molds built by criminology textbooks. He was their blind spot, their error margin, their nightmare scenario, a man who seemed too slow to be clever, yet too dangerous to be ignored. The tragic truth? Everyone underestimated him. And because of that, women died. It started quietly, the way most storms do, just a ripple before the full collapse. In 1969, Watts was only 15 years old when he committed his first known assault. A teenage girl was attacked near her home, strangled into unconsciousness before being left on the ground. She survived, but police brushed it aside as a freak incident. A mugging gone wrong, a local boy's wild mistake. Nobody thought they had just glimpsed the opening move of one of the deadliest predators in American history. By his late teens, the attacks had become a rhythm. Women, often strangers walking alone, were targeted at random. He didn't pursue them with charm or deception. He didn't lure them into cars with promises of safety. He simply rushed forward like an erupting fault line, striking, choking, drowning, stabbing, then vanishing back into obscurity. Witnesses rarely got a good look. Survivors often couldn't believe their attacker was that same awkward, almost childlike man they'd seen around town. The first confirmed murder came in 1974. His victim, a young woman in Michigan, was found strangled. The newspapers didn't connect it to anything larger. Detroit was drowning in crime at the time. Another death in a city already counting dozens barely registered. And so Watts' appetite grew under the radar. The disturbances multiplied. Neighbors whispered about a phantom who seemed to strike out of nowhere. College campuses circulated warnings, urging women to walk in pairs at night, but they couldn't give a description because there wasn't one. Watts moved like fog, shapeless, formless, impossible to trap. His face never fit the myth of a killer, so nobody guessed him. There's something unnerving about how his crimes escalated, not with theatricality, but with frequency. He didn't send taunts to police or carve messages into skin. He didn't brag. He just kept killing. It was as though the violence was an involuntary tick, an unstoppable reflex. Detectives struggled to form theories because they couldn't even answer the most basic question. Why? It wasn't revenge. It wasn't greed. It wasn't even lust, though sometimes sexual undertones lurked at the edges. Watts himself would later insist he killed women because he saw evil in them, a shapeless evil only he could recognize. He said he felt compelled to wipe it out. Whether this was delusion or justification, no one could be sure. What is clear is that he believed it, and belief is enough to turn thought into action. That first disturbance, a girl choked on a quiet Michigan street, wasn't just an isolated crime. It was a spark that lit decades of fire. Society barely noticed, and that silence gave Watts everything he needed: time. By the late 1970s, something strange was happening in Detroit. Women were turning up dead, young, old, black, white. It didn't seem to matter. Their lives ended in eerily similar ways. Strangulation, drowning, stabbing, always sudden, always brutal. Police files stacked higher and higher, each case half-solved, then shoved into a drawer marked pending. Detectives muttered about a pattern, but no one dared say the word serial. That was a label reserved for masterminds, not for the chaotic rubble of random urban killings. But randomness was Watts' camouflage. His crimes didn't follow the rules criminologists loved to map out on chalkboards. He didn't stalk his victims for weeks. He didn't leave behind cryptic signatures. He didn't even focus on a narrow type. No blondes between 20 and 35. No ritualistic staging. To the outside eye, his killings look like a patchwork quilt of senseless tragedies, stitched together by coincidence rather than design. And that was the problem, because investigators were trained to look for order. What's thrived in disorder? Some officers whispered that maybe there was no single killer, that these were just byproducts of living in a decaying city. Others started to wonder if they were dealing with a ghost. And for survivors, because yes, some women did survive his attacks, their testimonies only deepened confusion. They describe a man who looked ordinary, not slick, not terrifying, not unforgettable, just ordinary. Forgettable, even. His face slipped through memory like water through fingers. Psychologists later tried to explain this away. Watts' low IQ made him less able to construct elaborate fantasies or criminal signatures, so his killings lacked the theatrical elements that make most predators visible. Instead, he struck with raw instinct. Simple, savage, and therefore much harder profile. It was like trying to predict lightning. Meanwhile, rumors spread. Women were told not to walk alone, to carry whistles, to look over their shoulders. Yet no one knew who they were looking for. Was it a stranger? A co-worker? A neighbor? Fear metastasized into paranoia. Every ordinary man began to look suspicious, and that suspicion poisoned whole communities. The deepening mystery wasn't just the body count. It was the void where motive should have been. Investigators, journalists, even families of victims couldn't stop asking, why? Why would man with nothing to gain risk everything again and again? Watts had no grand philosophy, no demand for attention. He killed, then went home, like clocking out after a shift. That absence of meaning, that void, was somehow more terrifying than any ideology. Because if killing required no reason at all, then anyone, anywhere, could be next. By 1980, the case files read like a graveyard catalog. Pages of names, ages, crime scenes, each one eerily disconnected yet whispering the same question. Is someone out there pulling the strings? The problem was, there weren't any strings. Watts didn't leave neat trails of breadcrumbs. He left chaos. And chaos makes detectives nervous. Detroit police were overwhelmed. Bodies surfaced in rivers, behind apartment complexes, in abandoned lots, and no single detective could stitch the geography into a coherent map. They had too many cases, too few resources, and too many blind alleys. Add to that a society riddled with prejudice. Some victims were written off as runaways, others lumped into the vague category of street crimes. The system simply didn't take the pattern seriously until it was far too late. When Watts moved to Houston in 1981, he found himself in another metropolis staggering under its own weight. Houston's police were equally buried in violent crime. Here was a killer's paradise, a city expanding faster than law enforcement could track, neighborhoods disconnected by sprawling highways, and a justice system so strained that even the most obvious cases slipped through cracks. Survivors gave descriptions, but they were frustratingly inconsistent. Some swore he was short, others thought tall. Some said thin, others stocky. His ordinariness was his invisibility cloak. There was nothing distinctive to glue him in anyone's memory. One sketch looked like half the men in Houston. Psychologists floated theories, once Watts finally came under suspicion. One school insisted he was driven by deep-seated rage against women, rooted in childhood disappointments and rejections. Another believed his low IQ meant he couldn't articulate his compulsions, so he defaulted to vague statements like they were evil or I had to. Others argued that his killings resembled obsessive-compulsive behavior more than traditional predation, compulsions erupting until satisfied, then briefly subdued. Investigators also had to confront an unnerving paradox. Was Watts too unintelligent to fully understand right from wrong? Or was his simplicity exactly what made him so dangerous? Courts had long relied on IQ tests to determine culpability. But here was a man whose every action screamed intent. He might not have been able to calculate taxes or understand metaphors, but he understood perfectly well how to strangle a stranger and vanish. Some detectives suspected him early, but suspicion without evidence is just paranoia in a badge. Watts left no fingerprints, no murder weapons, no trophies. He didn't brag to friends, didn't drink himself into confessions, didn't keep journals. He killed, he left, he forgot. And that absence of ego was perhaps his most horrifying trait. Murder wasn't performance for him. It was maintenance. So theories stacked higher and higher, and still the killing continued. Investigators weren't chasing a man anymore. They were chasing fog. It happened almost absurdly because of a mistake. Not a grand piece of detective genius. Not a cinematic raid. Just a slip in the dark. In 1982, a woman in Houston managed to fight Watts off. She scratched, screamed, made enough of a scene that neighbors heard and rushed out. Watts fled, but not fast enough. Police caught up to him within hours. And suddenly, the Phantom had a body. What followed was chaos. Detectives who had been staring at faceless files for years were now looking into the wide, oddly blank eyes of a man who seemed more confused than cunning. Watts sat in an interrogation room slouched, speaking in slow, almost childlike sentences. He wasn't the charismatic Hannibal Lecter type. He didn't boast or taunt. He just seemed dim, too dim. In fact, for many to believe he could be the monster responsible for dozens of unsolved murders. But here's the twist that makes your stomach knot. Prosecutors struggled to pin homicides on him. There wasn't enough forensic evidence. No witnesses linking him directly to the bodies. No smoking gun. They had him on attempted murder and burglary, sure, but not the blood-soaked truth. And so, the legal system did something both desperate and deeply unsettling. They cut a deal. Watts agreed to confess to 12 murders in Michigan and Texas in exchange for immunity from prosecution in those cases. Let that sink in. Immunity. He could talk freely, admit freely, and still walk away untouched by charges for those deaths. The prosecutors thought it was clever. Better to get answers for grieving families than let the cases rot in cold storage. But to the public, it was incomprehensible. How could a confessed serial predator walk away from murder charges like they were parking tickets? The confessions themselves were chilling. Watts rattled them off like grocery items. This woman strangled near her apartment. That one drowned in a tub, another stabbed while walking home. No drama, no emotion, just matter-of-fact recollections, as if he were remembering chores. He didn't know the women's names. He didn't care to. They were shadows, erased for relief. The breakdown wasn't just what's being caught. It was the justice system itself. Families who had waited years for answers were now told, yes, he killed her. No, he won't be punished for it. The immunity deal was a bureaucratic nightmare dressed as victory. But cracks had finally appeared in Watts' armor. He was locked away for 60 years, not for the murders, but for burglary with intent to kill. It was a technicality, a patch job, a desperate attempt to cage him. For the first time, the Phantom wasn't fog anymore. He was flesh. He was inside prison walls. But everyone knew it wasn't enough. On paper, the story should have ended in 1982. Watts, locked away on a 60-year sentence, stripped of his freedom, his ability to hunt. But the law is never as permanent as stone. It bends, cracks, and sometimes breaks. And in this case, it broke in the most terrifying way. In 2002, after serving just 20 years, Coral Eugene Watts was scheduled for release. The technical details are maddening. because of changes in sentencing laws and the peculiarities of how his case was charged. His 60 years were effectively cut down to a fraction. Imagine being one of the families who've been told their daughter's killer was safely behind bars, only to hear he could walk free within months. The outrage was volcanic. Communities in Michigan and Texas erupted with fear. Petitions circulated. Governors received desperate letters. How could a man who admitted to killing at least a dozen women, and was suspected in dozens more, be allowed to stroll out the prison gates? Authorities scrambled. The immunity deal from the 80s meant they couldn't retry him for the murders he'd already confessed to, so they went digging. They unearthed cold cases that hadn't been part of his original confession list, searching for just one charge strong enough to slam the door shut again. And then, like an unburied bone, they found it. The 1979 murder of Helen Dutcher, a woman stabbed in the chest more than a dozen times. Watts had never been granted immunity for that killing. He was tried in 2004, and this time the jury didn't hesitate. Guilty, life sentence. But the lingering questions never stopped echoing. How many women did he really kill? He hinted at dozens, maybe 80. Some investigators whispered the number could be higher, hidden in the gaps of America's neglected case files, buried in rivers and ditches, forgotten in cities already too numb from violence. And why did he target women so indiscriminately? His claim that they were evil feels less like an explanation and more like a veil, something primitive and delusional that shielded even him from the truth of his own compulsions. In prison, he was once asked if he thought he was insane. His answer was blunt, almost annoyed. No, I just had to. Resolution came in the form of steel bars, but it was an uneasy one. Watts died in 2007 from prostate cancer, leaving behind a record both incomplete and bottomless. Justice, if you can call it that, was partial. He took secrets to his grave, and behind those secrets, a body count the full world may never be able to name. When Coral Eugene Watts finally died in 2007, there was no cinematic finale, no deathbed confession, no sudden burst of remorse. Just cancer eroding the body of a man who had already eroded dozens of lives. Some families of victims felt relief that he would never breathe free air again. Others felt cheated, convinced he had taken more names with him into the ground than he ever admitted. But his shadow didn't die with him. Watts left behind a crater in the criminal justice system, a case study so bizarre that law schools and criminology departments still stumble over it. He exposed every weak seam in law enforcement. The over-reliance on forensic patterns, the dismissal of crimes against women as isolated, the dangerous assumption that low intelligence equals low threat. Watts was proof that violence doesn't need genius to survive. It just needs persistence and opportunity. The immunity deal in particular became infamous. Prosecutors believed they were securing truth for grieving families, but instead, they created one of the most grotesque legal loopholes in modern memory. It forced courts to rethink how far deals should go when bargaining with monsters. Should closure ever outweigh punishment? Should a confessed killer ever be rewarded with immunity simply because evidence is thin? Watts' case became the grim example professors brought up when teaching young lawyers about unintended consequences. And then there was the cultural scar. In both Michigan and Texas, his name became shorthand for the failure to protect. Generations of women grew up with their mothers warning them, "Don't walk alone at night. Remember Watts." His crimes bled into local lore, the way certain shadows outlive the body that cast them. Even psychology wasn't spared. Experts scrambled to reconcile his profile, a man with limited intellect, unable to strategize in traditional ways, yet capable of serial predation across years and states. He forced the field to consider that killers aren't always masterminds. They can be blunt instruments, ruled by urges rather than calculations. That insight shifted how behavioral profiling was taught, and still unnerves investigators. How many other predators are dismissed because they don't look smart enough? Watts' legacy is paradoxical. He left behind no manifesto, no twisted philosophy, no mythologized brilliance. Just a wake of death, a broken legal system, and the haunting reminder that sometimes the most frightening monsters aren't the brilliant ones. They're the ordinary faces we forget to fear. Picture this. A man who could barely understand abstract reasoning, who scored an IQ lower than what most school systems consider functional, outmaneuvered police across 2 states, and took the lives of possibly 80 women. That's the paradox that gnaws at the bones of this story. Intelligence, the holy grail we so often worship as a marker of danger, wasn't what made Coral Eugene Watts lethal. It was his lack of it. Think about it. Most serial predators get caught because their egos trip them up. They want credit, attention, some twisted form of immortality. Watts wanted none of that. He didn't write letters to newspapers, didn't stage scenes, didn't bask in infamy. He killed like someone scratching an itch. Relief, he called it. No flair, no trophies, just the terrible simplicity of compulsion. And because of that simplicity, he was harder to track than killers with IQs twice his own. He was beneath suspicion, hidden under the mask of ordinariness. There's a kind of sick irony here. Society assumes danger comes wrapped in sharpness. Sharp words, sharp wits, sharp eyes. But what's proved danger can also come wrapped in dullness. And the man no one looks twice at. It forces us to ask questions most people don't want to entertain. If intelligence isn't required for evil, then what is? If cruelty doesn't need cleverness to thrive, then how many other harmless figures slip past our instincts every single day? Some investigators still whisper about the bodies they never found, the cases that still don't quite fit, but feel like his. He died with secrets sealed in that simple mind, secrets he couldn't or wouldn't put into words. The silence he left behind is louder than any confession. And maybe that's the darkest legacy of Coral Eugene Watts. Not just the deaths he caused, but the realization that evil doesn't need brilliance to flourish. Sometimes it only needs opportunity in a world too distracted or too arrogant to imagine that someone so slow could move so fast, so often, for so long. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.